Good afternoon or good morning, if you are, depending on the time zone you're in. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. We're happy to welcome those of you who are joining us on Zoom or who are joining us on our other live stream interactions here. We are coming to you, or at least I am coming to you from Broadband Communities in Houston. I've been here since Sunday. We had Broadband Breakfast together with Broadband Communities, hosted Digital Infrastructure Investment, a half-day mini conference on the joining of the financial services and broadband infrastructure communities. And the conference continues until Thursday. So I'm here, but some of our panelists are here, but most are not. But that's really the cool thing about what we're trying to do here at Broadband Breakfast Live Online is we're joining together the virtual and the in-person events. And that's what we did at our program yesterday, Digital Infrastructure Investment, and replays of that are available. Today, we're going to be talking about rural deployments, rural networks, and looking at best practices for delivering rural networks. We have some great guests with us here to talk about this topic. Let me just, before I introduce our guests, I do want to just mention some of the things that sort of are in the air in the broadband world, both here at Broadband Communities and nationwide. Broadband Communities, there's been a good turnout here, obviously somewhat depressed by the Delta variant and Texas, but we do definitely have a great audience that is focused on all aspects of broadband infrastructure and deployment. And I think the overwhelming issue or additional issue that we're seeing is what kind of aspects and impacts the broadband infrastructure legislation package that is currently on the Hill, that is likely to come for a vote tomorrow, that is set to put $65 billion into broadband on top of the dozens or scores of billions that's already been authorized through different programs that we won't get into in detail here today. But that question about how to manage this pending influx of new funds for broadband infrastructure is definitely on a lot of people's minds. And we'll continue to talk about that in future events. But again, that is perhaps a bit in the background here, and we certainly want that to be part of our discussion as we broaden it out to all of our panelists here. So give me a moment and I will open it up to our panelists here. We're very, very excited to have with us today Colin Wood, who is the CEO of TWN Communications, Trans World Network, and they've been offering enterprise-focused long-distance services and kind of pivoted into broadband, really focusing on the rural and co-op market. We're going to let Colin tell us a little bit more about his story just now. We're also joined by Lori Sherwood. Thank you, Lori, for being with us. Lori is the Director of Commercial and Market Development for Render Networks, and Lori's had a great strategic industry focused career in broadband with a particular focus on rural communities and uncovering solutions for them. So we're looking forward to hearing from her too. We hope we'll have one more panelist, but we're still waiting for him. So we look forward to the discussion as it evolves. So with that brief intro, Colin, let's turn to you and feel free to take several minutes, take 5-7 minutes to tell us a little bit about TWN and how you all have focused on deploying broadband to your rural marketplace communities.
Sure, Drew. And thank you for the kind words. Just probably best if I jump into an explanation of exactly how TWN goes about the process of entering into partnerships with rural electric cooperatives. And we've done this for well over 20 years. As you mentioned before, we back in many years ago worked in long distance communication, that type of thing. But since 2005, we've been primarily involved in building broadband networks, and specifically in partnership with electric cooperatives. And the projects, over time, the capital associated with deploying these projects is very considerable. And especially as fibers, begin to really dominate in many of the rural marketplaces, we in 2018 opted to revamp our entire project planning approach to design and construct, as well as operate broadband networks, fiber networks, which takes a significant amount of planning, both in terms of understanding demand, as well as understanding what the various implications on designs are going to be as you go through and validate the design based on initially a feasibility level, and then a higher level design, all the way through into validation, various steps of field validation. So we really try and be as efficient as we possibly can as we build these networks. As I say, we've done it for a number of years, but in the last 3 years in particular, we really began to engage. You use the term digital. We'll go with that. Digital design, as well as construction management. And it's been a very enlightening process. I believe we drive significant efficiencies. To the audience, I would certainly say that one of the best investments that anyone that's in the let's say preparing for a project that needs to probably undertake is to ensure you have a very deep capability insofar as your own IT personnel to work with the various platforms that are going to be key insofar as ensuring that labor costs are controlled, material, which the past year and a half, tried to work with material management has been an extremely challenging process. And so that all our folks on project planning, whether they're in our headquarters area or the design group, or whether they're in the field construction personnel, that type of thing, everyone is engaged with a common set of digital tools to ensure that we're maximizing our productivity and not being hung up and having cycles go wasting, so to speak, as a result of waiting for material and that type of thing. So it's been a really good experience. And as I say, we've been designing, building, and constructing broadband networks for like 16 plus years. But in the last 3, we've really changed our approach. And all I can say is that it is a really key part of the success of the projects that we are working on today.
Well, wonderful. Let me just broaden the view again here. It's great to talk about what we are going to is the transformation, if you will, that you just spoke about, and the way that you've been able to really engage this set of tools. But just 1 or 2 more minutes on the philosophy. Could you just speak to what your philosophy is as an aid to electric co-ops, and how TWN kind of facilitates this, in my view, very significant development of rural electric co-ops waking up to this opportunity?
Sure. In fact, rural electric cooperatives, which have been around since the 1930s, they're community-based. They're like almost like credit unions. They're owned by the members that they serve, who in turn elect a board of directors that appoints management. So they're electric utilities, so they're conservative to begin with, and then they're rural community-based organizations, and so that element of conservatism is probably even more significant insofar as their DNA. We began working with electric co-ops in the late 1990s, and continue. That's virtually the only entities that we partner with today, and we understand them, have deep relationships there, And the reason that I think that we've sort of approached that marketplace from the perspective that, we're in this for the long haul, although we're a private company, our our sort of philosophy is very much in the long run. And so we make investments alongside electric co-ops in broadband networks, and we want to do it in ways that reduces their risk. So, many projects, let's say, a typical project, for say $10 million, maybe, we would share roughly 20 million, or sorry, 2 million out of 10. It comes from TWN, 8 million comes from the co-ops. We have not only a partnership insofar as the legalities, if you will, of designing networks, constructing networks, and operating them into the future. We also bear a significant amount of the financial risk, and we also assist very much insofar as access to things such as grant funds and that type of thing. So understanding co-ops and understanding their conservative nature and how big some of these financial commitments are for them, we feel that it's important that the risks be shared. And we're a carrier that's been around for a long time. We know how to design these networks. We know how to get them built, and we definitely know how to operate them. And all of those things are giant risks for co-ops. I mean, the financial risk is giant. The design of these networks, proper designs, that's a giant issue. Actually building them and constructing them in a way that they're future-proof. We deliver, to every single residence, symmetrical 1 gig speeds in rural areas, for enterprise up to 40 gigs. I mean, you really have to plan well, and you have to make sure that the economics and the risks are well controlled, as well controlled as can be.
Well, no, that's great additional context, and particularly this emphasis on risk sharing. I think that's a good lead into Lori and the work that you're doing with at Render Networks. How do the tools that Render Networks has work in collaboration with a TWN and the rural co-ops in these builds? To tell us a little bit about that, Lori, and as well a little bit about yourself and Render Networks generally.
Great. Thank you, Drew. It's a pleasure to be with you always on Broadband Breakfast, and greetings to the broadband community's family today. Render Networks is a digital construction management platform, and we work with companies. In fact, TWN is one of our partner companies in building out the network. We're not a design firm. We're not a construction firm. We sort of fit in the middle of the ecosystem. And we help manage everything from the field validation process all the way through to drops. And we do this digitally so that it removes paper from the process. And you have a digital record of everything happening in the field, whereas accurately geolocated, all of the information is at your fingertips and visible in real time and transparent. And, this is really kind of a game changer for the industry. I mean, I've been in the industry for 20 years. I spent a significant amount of time working with municipalities across the country. And part of what the challenge is being able to build these networks with efficiency and transparency so that you can catch issues that are happening out in the field in real time. You don't have the luxury of waiting down the road a month or 2 months to get the data from the field and all the information you need to determine that you have an issue somewhere. It seems crazy to me that we are in the business of building innovation, right? Fiber networks are a catalyst for innovation. Yet our industry is primarily still a paper-based industry. We're still using old-fashioned tools.
How much, Lori, sorry to jump in.
Yeah.
I just want to give us a sense for how much paper infused this construction industry is.
I don't know percentage-wise. I don't have any data to sort of give you a sense of percentage. I would say just certainly a majority. Although it's shifting rapidly, right? Where companies like TWN have realized that, you can make your resources go so much further if you use a digital approach. And it really just, it's a small shift in thinking to say, you know what, we really don't need paper anymore. We can do this digitally. We can trust the data that we're getting out in the field. That's the benefit of GIS, is that everything is geolocated to a point on a map where you can see that and trust it, as opposed to relying on folks in the field who are using, these old processes and paper and scribbling notes.
Do you need broadband out in the field to access these digital tools?
You do not. Nope. You can, for render example, you need an iPad. You can sync up your tasks before you head out in the field in the morning, and then you can work offline all day and then sync back up when you get back to a Wi-Fi signal or a wireless signal. So it's, there really isn't a barrier to using these tools other than just changing a shift in thinking and saying, you know what, I think we can trust the innovation and technology that we have now, and make this a better process.
I want to also get at this issue of how the digital tools work, particularly for the rural environment, right? And I think both of you, Lori and Colin, can speak to this. What is different about a rural build, or a build for a rural electric co-op, such as TWN is doing, and maybe a more urban or suburban build from a perspective of actually implementing it, putting the playbook together, delivering on it. Whichever would you like to go first on that?
Here, Colin, I'll turn it to you to go first. This is in your wheelhouse.
Okay. Well, I guess simply put, in many cases, we're working in rural environments where the information that we've ingested as part of a feasibility study, let's say, utilizing GIS information from the power utility itself, we find frequently that these are smaller, typically utilities. This is not a Tampa Electric or Duke. These are maybe 40,000 meter, 20,000 meter electric cooperatives, and so therefore they're stretched very thin insofar as their own internal resources. And when an initial design is created as best as possible, utilizing that information that we acquire from the GIS experts at the various co-ops we work with, that information has to be validated. And as a project moves forward, that validation goes deeper and deeper into the network, and so therefore, redesign is required. Right up until the moment that you begin to blueprint, and as Lori was saying, actually doing that in a digital fashion, you want to make sure that you've really validated your information very, very well to ensure that when you actually go to actually create a bunch of tasks, in this case, digital tasks for crews to actually act upon, you've really improved the data set that the utility initially has. So we actually help utilities in the process. It's kind of a positive byproduct, improve their own information significantly as to where a recloser is, and specifically where your transmission corridors are, where some of your underground locates and whatnot for power and that type of thing. You thought it was here, but in fact, it's actually there. We feed that information back to the electric co-op. So we gain in terms of flexibility because we spend that time up front in the design phase to ensure we have a really, really good set of data before we go to blueprint it. And as I say, as a result of going through those iterative sort of stages, we're able to provide, real-time information to the electric co-ops to be able to update and upgrade their data sets themselves for the GIS coordinates of their own infrastructure. And that all, it's really important to sequence it properly. And it's really important to ensure that as you're going through the process and getting ready to blueprint and getting ready to actually press the button, Now, now you've got crews, and now you've got material inbound. Now you're starting to spend real money. So to sequence it properly and do those design purifications and corrections and whatnot in terms of the course of the progression all the way from feasibility into a blueprint is really important for everyone. And that is probably one of the biggest cost savings I can identify in the entire sequencing of these projects, is making sure that the planning and whatnot and continuously improving the design takes place. Like in our company, it takes place every single day in preparation for actually getting to a point where something is going to get built.
So that point you just made, Colin, the continuous improvement, are you saying that's continuous improvement in terms of knowledge of where physical assets are and how they're used? Is that what you're saying, or is there another point there?
Well, it is that, Drew, but also it's the improvement of the actual designs themselves. So as you realize, okay, well, this particular thing, we thought it was here. It's in fact not there. So therefore, validation tells you, oh, okay, redo the design. And therefore you're not going to build something someplace when you're in the field that shouldn't be built in that way. Right. So you're capturing that and improving the designs as you go through these different levels of validation. One real fun thing as well, because as a carrier, we interface with other carriers in creating northbound connections into our network designs, and we're responsible for building that infrastructure right down to the transport layer. And one of the designs that we had in the Midwest, we found out that where the carrier we were working with had designed where we should interconnect was actually at the bottom of a reservoir. So when you determine there's certain things that aren't where you thought that they were going to be, you can correct that when you're still working with the design models prior to blueprinting, prior to actually undertaking work, which clearly if you've got crews and material, you're spending money and they're looking at something that can't be built.
We would definitely want to talk about crews and readiness, but Lori, I want to give you a chance to elaborate a little bit more your perspective on how an entity like TWN or others kind of takes and better understands their existing digital assets through making use of this process.
Yeah, I mean, Drew, just to before I get to that point, I just wanted to add on to what your previous question was regarding rural builds. And so, I think across the board, right, we have labor shortages, we have material shortages. And so we need to look at creative ways to improve the process so that we can save money and time in other areas. And digital innovation allows you to do that. Digital deployment allows you to do that, to shrink that time frame so that you know exactly where your assets are built, how many you've used, what the serial numbers are of your fiber reels. And this is particularly important for high cost builds in rural areas where you need to have savings anywhere you can find them. And just using traditional methods isn't going to get you to that savings place, to that place where you can both save your time, reduce your FTEs that you need for a particular build and with the labor shortages, and track your materials. And so, that's a really important feature that's particularly relevant to rural builds.
Okay. So, thanks for that. And did you want to add something else in terms of how an entity like TWN kind of gets a better understanding of its own data using your tools?
Oh, sure. I mean, when you're collecting data out in the field, when you're building a network, right, you're doing this for a long-term basis. You don't just need the information for the period of time that you're deploying the network. You need to have accurate records long-term. And this goes for both existing infrastructure and infrastructure post-build. ultimately it's the sustainability of the network that is going to be, that you have in mind, right? This is why you've designed the network. This is why you build it. You build it for sustainability. You need to know where those assets are located. You need to know, as much information about them so that you have a downstream success with that, with your BSS, OSS systems, long-term, and really the sustainability issue is one piece that is missing in a lot of the conversations about funding, who's going to get the money. It's a huge question that we need to be able to invest in companies like TWN that have a track record of sustainability, because, if you're just handing out funds to someone that hasn't been around, doesn't know how to do this, long term, what is that going to mean? So I think that, the digital approach really helps you in terms of knowing where your assets are, existing, future, where you need to build, and then all the information around that you need for sustainable operations.
So thank you, Lori. Let's move to this topic of readiness, and this is kind of crucial at this moment. And like I said at the top, there's a lot of discussion here at Broadband Communities and in the industry about the new funding, which is kind of very appreciated, and yet it's like there is a concern. I know people are talking about is supplies, materials, labor, shortages, and now we're kind of in the whole question of planning and funding applications, shovel readiness, delivery readiness. What are some of your thoughts, Colin and Lori, on what providers can do to get ready or be as ready as possible for their network deployments?
I feel bad. I'm always stepping in front of you, Lori, but
Go ahead, Colin.
Okay.
I spoke last. You're good.
Well, I guess the issue of readiness is really, really I think on almost anyone's mind that's been involved in this industry for some time and has some experience with things such as funding opportunities. The way in which I'll just take one small example. The way in which in many cases, for instance, ACA funding is being repurposed or flushed through the hands of various states, and the way in which they've approached how they want to have some of these funds utilized has been instructive. In many cases, states are looking to repurpose funds for economic development in sort of the shadow of COVID for specific either counties and or incorporated or unincorporated cities where it's determined that in many cases the census block group may very well show that there's broadband, but it might be just like one small piece down in the corner over here. And there's ample opportunity to explain, no, in fact, there's significantly underserved. It was underscored during 2020. Communities where potential employers or people working from home, they need to have true broadband. Those kinds of cases can dovetail very nicely with some of the ACA funding that's available from various states. But it's not sufficient. I mean, it's necessary, but that's not sufficient. You also have to have a study, and a feasibility study, which also goes to the level of having a very good understanding at a feasibility design level, if you will, of what the bill of materials is going to look like for that particular build, for that particular political, dot on a map someplace. And then it has to dovetail into what that cost is going to look like versus what kind of revenues are going to be attained from that. And Lori made the point about sustainability. It's got to be an executable business model, and it has to be sustainable so that it's not seen that these public funds are invested into something which literally at some point in time in the future has to be acquired someplace out by another, maybe larger entity or something of that nature, that it really is built for the communities that these funds are intended to assist. So, as the funding opportunities take place and notifications come out for these funding opportunities, it's essential that any entity, whether it's a city, a town, a county, in conjunction with a private sector partner such as us, works together to develop that plan and be ready to respond, because sometimes they don't give a lot of time to be able to respond and develop all the responses necessary to make the application. And if there's anything I can say to anyone out there who's listening, who's considering a project, it would be, get ready, get your study done, get the necessary economics, do some sampling in your community of need, and have proof with it, things like affidavits, that there are areas that are underserved within your community, so that you've got a very, very strong data set, and it's pretty much on the shelf, ready to go when a funding opportunity strikes.
Lori, I definitely want to get your response, but let me just add in one more question to feel free to incorporate this in, which is to say, could a potential user of Render Networks tools aid the process of an application kind of by getting going on the tool even before a build has been funded? I just want to kind of put that out there, and also your response on this question of readiness.
So Render is not a planning tool. However, we work with partners that do that type of thing. Where Render comes into the application process is in the application itself, in terms of that sustainability question, right? You need to be able to explain to the people funding your network that you have a plan for executing the deployment. The plan is appropriate for the amount of money for what you're saying it's going to do. You know exactly how you're going to build it, the data you're collecting. You have a plan for that post-award reporting, which is really key. And one of the features of Render that we can do is we can work with a grantee or an applicant on customizing dashboards that are fed off of the data collected in the field in real time, so that you can literally see in front of you on your computer at any time exactly where you stand in terms of your metrics and milestones that you need for post-award reporting. And that is some transparency that you just don't have with paper. You don't have that ability. I mean, 10 years ago, I directed the Maryland BTOP project for ICBN, right? And we had an issue, for example, at the end of the project where I was looking at the bills and I started to see an abnormal amount of splicing costs associated with one segment. So we sent an engineer out to inspect it. And it turns out that the subcontractor, instead of using one cable reel for a particular segment that it actually was going into a head end, they took scraps of fiber and spliced them together, which of course is, a design nightmare in terms of latency and all of that. But it took us 6-8 weeks before we realized what had happened in the field, because the work was done. It went back to the contractor. They generate the invoices. It came to me. I realized something was happening. We sent engineers out to inspect it. So that was a 3-month process between the identification and then the correction. With Render, that won't happen, because you can see in real time what is happening out in the field, and you will catch anything like that happens the day after the work is completed.
Yeah. Let me ask a question I've just got from our audience here anonymously. What are your thoughts, whether the tools you're currently using enable this or don't, or how they might? How could we make sure that the projects that are being planned don't just don't just have the tools to build the infrastructure, but to enable connectivity for the applications, right? For the distributed telehealth, for distance learning, for workforce development. How might those be included? Just any thoughts that Lori or Colin you have on this topic?
Just a quick thought that, most networks that are being built these days are not being built for a minimum speed, right? You don't build those networks to achieve 25.3. They're built to achieve gigabit plus and then some, right? The fiber is the enabling technology to enable that. So, with the amount of funding that is literally falling from the sky these days, I don't think that there's a concern with new networks. But one of the questions that should be asked is, what speeds can you guarantee will be utilized on the network? But I don't know any ISP provider company that is building networks that aren't going to be ready for expansion for increased speeds for years to come.
Okay. Great point. I'd like us to touch on three big topics in the remainder of our time together, and any others, Colin and Lori, that you and our guests on this platform and others might have. One is the issue of the digital delivery, right? And are there any kind of is there any proving that still needs to be done, or is it just proven and now it's more a matter of educating people? I'd also love to get both of your take on the GIS role in the planning, the geospatial information systems, and most importantly, perhaps, and we can feel free to kind of dive into this. I'd love to get, Colin, your thoughts on some of the projects that you've been underway. You mentioned up top at the start about how you've changed a lot over the last 3 years. Give us some examples. Walk us through some ways that your processes at TWN have changed over the last 3 years, and feel free to talk a little bit about some projects. I believe Mojave is one. Could you tell us a little bit more about some specific projects and how they're seeing these changes, Colin?
Sure. Well, just to sort of leverage a little bit on the comments that Lori was just making. In rural areas in particular, the approach to ensure that the networks that we're building are we refer to it as future proofing. We take into account the current demand points and anchor institutions and that type of thing. But by the same token, we're also looking, as I mentioned earlier, we're when our networks are built, as we build the different zones. Every single prem pass residential can get 1 gig up, 1 gig down. So none of this 25 meg down and 3 meg up stuff. It's a gig. We can dial it up by changing some of the optical equipment and bringing that to 1010 for residential. And we're starting with enterprise at 40 and 40 and the symmetrical speeds, and we call them sustained because it's not up to. And I think many providers in our space that are constructing networks today, that's what they're building. Do I think every single household needs a gig? Not necessarily, but more and more of them need it. And do I think in the future they're going to need 10 times that? Well, I didn't see the kind of growth that has taken place in this industry insofar as especially upload speed demand by consumers. So I'm just going to say we're building it that way for whatever eventuality comes. Talking about some of the projects we're active with at the moment, Mojave Electric, which is based in Arizona, very unique electric co-op in that they're perched on the edge of the Colorado River. Their territory goes north from Lake Havasu up into the Davis Dam area, and then they're bifurcated by mountain range, and then they have an eastern territory. So that some parts along the Colorado River are more urban, some parts adjacent to that are rural, and then some parts are very rural in terms of density. So
just tell me the state again we're talking about for this.
Arizona.
Okay.
In Arizona. So one of the big challenges in that area is it's quite isolated. It's literally in the middle of the Mojave Desert, roughly 2 hours southeast of Las Vegas. And to ensure that there was a design that could fit the requirements, not only for several different northbound connections to ensure that we had a good self-healing network, but also taking into account the existing infrastructure that the electric co-op has, as well as planned communities that either are on in the planning stage or partially built out, that type of thing, insofar as designs. And we have some very, very robust, you know, zones which are being fed by central office locations of 10,000 drops. So we have a design that has to accommodate density, multi-unit type residential buildings, multi urban business enterprise, hospitals, multiplicity of schools and educational facilities, on and on. And then on the rural side, the eastern side of their network, having, if you look at in terms of consumer per mile of line, there's less than one, drop per mile of line. And so therefore having, something that brings together the scale that's on the western side to help ensure that the eastern side can have the same speeds, but it's sustainable insofar as the way in which it's built. Doing that with the design process and then the actual digital blueprinting process ensures that we have information which is readily available to share with our partner, and funding sources which require specialized reporting as well. And there's a multiplicity of reasons to ensure that we're tracking this, we're able to build efficiently, and we're also able to keep everyone in virtually real time awareness of what's being built, and if there's any changes from what was expected, because all of a sudden a housing development did kick off, and so therefore we've got some red line changes and whatnot. We can produce that, very, very readily insofar as change orders and whatnot, keep track of it. So it's a very, it's a complicated build, but I will say this, as a result of using the different, digital platforms that we work with, we started construction in December, and in June we were hooking customers up. So really, rapid deployment given the complexities of this particular build. So, it's one of those things that I'm not sure we could have gotten there without the kinds of, digital tools that we use to make this happen.
We just got a question from one of our attendees. How are rural communities dealing with the planning and paperwork requirements? Either of you want to take that question?
Well, I mean, planning wise, it's, I think this is where a lot of the mistakes are made. There's a lot of time and money spent on the front end on things that don't need to be identified. The key is to, if you're a city, if you're a cooperative, first is to figure out what business model you're going to use. Are you going to become an ISP, or are you going to work with someone like TWN who's going to manage that process for you, and build and manage the network? And then second is to take care of that financial feasibility study to make sure that your numbers are accurate. You don't want to get halfway through your build and realize that, this isn't going the way we thought, we need more money, or to just be way off one way or another, not just with finances, but with your build out schedule, et cetera, the cost of materials. And so this is where a lot of communities and a lot of folks kind of stumble in the start. And so the other piece with paperwork, I'm not entirely sure what is meant by that, whether it's permitting or, paperwork could mean a lot of different things. But I would say on the planning side of things, there's a lot of time spent wasted in that front end components that people really need to pay more attention to and figure out how to do it better.
Well, thank you, Lori. I am so happy to say that we have been joined by our third panelist. He's probably right here in Houston, in another portion of the building that I am, and yet we're of course connecting online. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Paul. Tell us a little bit about yourself, BRE Networks. And as you may know, we're talking, of course, about delivering on rural deployments and best practices for doing so. So again, you probably haven't had the benefit of hearing what we're talking about, but tell us a little bit about yourself and your thoughts on this topic, and then we'll weave you into the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Drew, and apologies. I got my times totally mixed up. And yes, I am in Houston, so I should have just knocked on your door. Yeah, look, it's BRE Networks really, its purpose is to help accelerate digital equality, connect communities, and ultimately empower people. That's the purpose of why we exist as an organization. We try to do that by offering solutions, tech-enabled service solutions and software solutions into the telecommunication industry, whereby we partner with organizations and others to help accelerate and hopefully ultimately bridge this digital divide that we have here in this country. We're a global company, but most of the work we do is in America, and mainly rural America. And look, we've been in this space in the US for about 6 years, and it's been a great experience for us to work with many rural towns, rural co-ops, and organizations such as TWN, which really make it, all come together. So, for us, one of the things that we really enjoy doing and our team enjoys doing is working with and collaborating with organizations that have those relationships into those communities or those co-ops, and we can make a difference. So, we've been working with Colin and his team for quite some time now. And quite frankly, I only get great feedback from my team on how that experience is going. And I think one of the most important things there is a transparent and collaborative approach. I think that's important in terms of how we try to solve this challenge and try to get people connected. So it's, we focus on the design and engineering side of things, but we also provide a platform that goes a bit deeper downstream. We get involved in a lot of early stage conversations as well. And oftentimes that's where we would come in and say, look, you should be talking to the likes of TWN, or you should be talking to this person here. This is more, for them at this stage, and we'll come in and help them and support them downstream when they're ready. So yeah, it's that's mainly what we do. And we at the moment have about 20 to 25 different co-op projects on the go in the US of varying sizes. And there's looking at what's coming down the pipe, in particular with private money at the moment, and fingers crossed we have federal money coming downstream soon as well. We think there's just a lot to do, an opportunity to make an impact.
Well, Paul, two of the things we've been talking about are of course how those federal funds will impact projects, rural projects in particular. But we've also been talking about the way entities like TWN working so closely with electric co-ops have been able to accelerate and provide, if you will, a best practice model. Perhaps we could have Lori weigh in a little bit on how platforms like BRE, Render Networks, and others fit into this stage, fit into the workflow, if you will, that Colin and the companies, the co-ops you work with will need. I remember, Lori, had a great presentation at Mountain Connect that you were part of that did a wonderful job at this. And I wonder if you just take a minute or two to kind of describe that, and then maybe get Paul's take on it, and then close out with Colin's.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's great that all of three of us work really well together here, you know, on the TWN projects. And the reason being is that BRE, they're on the front end, right? So they're doing all of the design, all of the work to put that together. When the design's complete, they send it to us. And what we do with it is we ingest it into the render platform in a series of task-based sequences that are in essentially the order in which you would construct them. So that and the reason for doing that is because we put the tasks into the system, release them to the crews, but nothing gets released into the crews until the prior work is completed. So for example, you would never send someone out to do splicing before the cable was placed. And so what Render enables you to do is take the GIS, the geospatial design from BRE with all the attributes, put it into our system, capture data on how it's constructed. And then at the end, send that data, create those as-builts digitally so that you're doing that in real time. And then on the back end, we would send that off to a fiber management system such as Vetro or whomever the customer was working with. And so that's really kind of how what we were talking about at Mountain Connect in terms of the ecosystem and how we all work together. And then the benefit to TWN, of course, in this instance, is that they have transparency. They can see that data. They know exactly what's happening. You know, ultimately, they're the ones managing the network on the back end. So they have confidence that that data is accurate. They know where everything is. They can see it and work with it, you know, a long term. So that's just kind of a general description of how that ecosystem works, but I'll turn it back over to Paul to talk about the front end of that.
Yeah, and make sure to unmute yourself, Paul.
Rookie error. Thanks, Laurie. I think one of the key distinctions, you know, Drew, when you mentioned what makes this a best-in-class sort of approach and why is this unique, what Render and BRE have in common is we undertake an algorithmic approach to the way that the systems deliver outcomes. So beyond just you know, in Render's case, having someone manually create those items and tickets of work, they are created, as Laurie said, automatically and algorithmically in a sequence. In a similar fashion, the way that our tech-enabled services deliver designs, those designs are algorithmic designs. So we configure a rule set when we sit down with our clients. In this case, we sat down over the course of a few days with Colin and his team, and we configured what the tool set needed to look like in order to deliver designs that were to spec essentially. And through the course of a number of iterations, you get to a point where it's like, yeah, that's where it needs to be, and now we can go larger scale through a broader for the entire deployment versus doing a small pilot. So for our approaches, that's one of the areas that is common, where we undertake it's beyond just automating certain elements. There's automation, but there's also optimization and some hardcore math behind the scenes to really help us along. And I think that's really important, because if we look at the wave of work that's coming, we're just not going to be able to train enough people to do this quick enough. It's the same with the construction force. It's going to be so difficult to train enough people to construct these networks. So the big advantage here is, one, you don't necessarily have to stand up a team yourself to go and do these elements together. You can just get them done effectively by people that this is what they do all the time. And secondly, it scales really well. So whether Colin's undertaking a project with 30,000 homes, or he's going to undertake a project with 200,000, it's the same approach from our perspective. And I think that provides a level of certainty and de-risks the deployment for Colin and his team, to know that is the approach is shored up, irrespective of the size of project that he's looking to undertake.
Colin, I'd love your reaction to what you've just heard here from Laurie and Paul.
Well, one of the points that can't be stressed enough, I think both Laurie and Paul made, was the importance of sequencing insofar as successfully planning and successfully kicking off or initiating construction work. Sequencing, all the way down to like the details of tasks and dependency, critically important. But I'll go back to a comment that I made, which is that, when you start off with a set of information, which you ingest to create feasibility level designs, and then you work to improve those designs through several iterations, that ensures that you're taking the best set of information possible into the blueprinting process, and then kicking off the actual what I'll call the expensive parts of putting people into the field, whether it's subcontractors, our own folks, queuing material properly, et cetera. So there's dependencies insofar as work tasks. There's also all kinds of dependencies insofar as ensuring that material is being fed to the project at the proper time, so that you're not creating any self-caused, so to speak, delays. The other comment which was made, and I can't remember who made it, but I will say collaboration is critically important. There are so many moving parts, and we have really, really experienced people that have done lots and lots of projects. Regardless, every project is the same in some respects, but every project's different. And so as a result, being able to have teams that can communicate with each other, resolve issues as they arise, and do it on a timely basis to ensure that the project itself is not being slowed down or resources being expended needlessly. Absolutely critical to the success of these projects.
I want to make sure we get a chance for each of you to speak to this issue of the role of GIS, the role of maths, right, Paul? The role of a digital all digital, no paper workforce. And so let's kind of make that sort of our last question, and then give you all a chance to make any closing comments while you do that. So just to kind of be clear, what is the role that sort of a true GIS system plays in changing the way fiber networks and rural fiber networks in particular are built, again, with a focus on co-ops in the case of Colin, but I assume those lessons apply everywhere. Let's hear from Paul, your thoughts, and then Lori, and then close it out with you, Colin.
Thanks, Drew. So I think the GIS and having that digital twin of your expected network and then your as-built network for operation is critical. I think having a GIS platform and having your data, and Colin, said this just before, the importance of getting that data set, the input data at the front end, and then transforming that information, that data into more detailed designs that then feed into a detailed and digital platform for construction is the quickest way, the most effective way. It's very objective, and it really de-risks a lot of the deployment, and it also allows you to be very transparent in terms of what's happening. From that end to end, you can see exactly where the project is at. You can see how many things have been designed, how many things have been constructed. So it's very easy to report. So if you start your project in a geospatial space, it's a lot easier to manage it and know exactly where you're at. We're helping an organization kicking off soon, whereby they didn't get to start like that. They didn't go down that path. They have no idea what they've built. All they know is that when they tried to light customers, it didn't work. And this is, I'm sure that's pretty common, unfortunately. And I think that the challenge, so now it's a matter of, okay, how far back do we have to unroll this thing? And, there's this education piece. So I think there's still a lot of education to be done that needs to be done in industry to really double down the importance of GIS and what it should be and how to use it effectively. Not only from capturing that input data, but how do you transform that in the appropriate way downstream? And finally, that data and the data flow has to be interoperable. That's the other big mistake we see people make, is as soon as they start going in and out of different disparate systems and they don't have interoperable schemas where the data dictionary can't talk, it just creates a lot of challenges. And that's where things get lost in the mix. And that's where, unfortunately, in cases where Colin and his team would come in. If we didn't have those things connected, things would get lost, and suddenly him and his team wouldn't be able to see exactly where things are at. So having interoperability end to end is also important in a geospatial platform.
Thank you very much, Paul. Lori.
Just quickly, I'd say what Paul said 150 times. Agree with that. The accuracy is the biggest issue, right? If you're out in the field and you have red lines, you have changes in the field, how can you be sure that the guy in the field is capturing those correctly on paper, and that the person reading those notes is making those changes accurately in the database? When it comes time for locates and down the road, how can you be sure which side of the street that the infrastructure was really placed on? You don't have that issue with utilizing a GIS approach to digital construction. And then I would say just with the avalanche of funding that's out there, I would encourage everyone to take a hard look at this, because there's not going to be a second chance for this. It's particularly for cooperatives. If you're looking and you have needs within your footprint, your territory, take a look at this, because if you don't go after this funding, someone else will for your area. So that was sort of my one takeaway there, and I will pass it on to Colin.
Wonderful, Colin. Bring us home and give us your final thoughts on this topic.
Well, my final thoughts is that those are two tough acts to follow on this subject, because they're both very clear insofar as why GIS works well and why it's so necessary to scale. There's absolutely no substitute for knowing where the assets you're building are actually located, and the keys that we talked about earlier insofar as planning processes and being able to do design and having optical budgets that are going to work, so that when you go to light up a customer, that you're working within parameters and you built within the parameters that were set out. And without that accurate GIS information, you just cannot do that with any level of confidence. The other sort of key is that for us, we look to not only the build, the tasks that are set out within the platforms to actually make the build happen. And if there is a change, if there is a red line, then that is reflected in the as-builts, and those as-builts are reported to things like critically important to be able to report that into the 811 system, their database for future locates, as well as understanding where everything was actually built. And for us, we're staying and we're operating these assets. So when we actually feed that into our own systems, which are then utilized for network management, and any trouble issues that occur into the future, it's absolutely critical that we know the data points for every single piece of infrastructure that's been built. And so there's, I guess I said, there's no substitute for having that information accurate so as to build and then captured for 811 purposes. And critically important for us as an operator in our operations center to be able to diagnose things, and operate successfully in the future.
Well, that's going to have to be our last word. Thank you so much to each of you for joining us for this hour. The live stream or the recording will be immediately available on the page afterward. We're here every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time, and look forward to welcoming you back for topics on better broadband, better lives. On behalf of Colin Wood, CEO of TWN, Lori Sherwood, Director of Commercial and Market Development, Render Networks, and Paul Saluz, CEO of Biari Networks, thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. Take care.